So in this video, we're going to talk about how to solve formulas that have either squares or square roots. So we'll talk about things that have squares like this, or if they have a square root. So whenever you're asked to solve a formula, usually you're given just like more variables than like a typical equation. I think a lot of times a different context. So in this case, it says to solve for x. So I have y equals 4x squared over z. So the whole thing with this is that the x is being squared, so we'll have to kind of deal with that later. But we're not going to worry about the fact that the x is squared right now. We're just going to isolate all of this x squared. So this is the thing I want to isolate. So to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply both sides by z, because technically 4x squared over z, this is a fraction, and one of the things we've talked about many times is to get rid of fractions, you just want to multiply, get rid of the denominator. So in multiplying both sides by z, the z's drop out, and now I'm left with zy equals 4x squared. So I still want to get the x squared by itself, so the next thing I'll do is I'll divide both sides by 4, and now I have x squared equals zy over 4. Okay, so now to solve for x, I want to take the square root of both sides. But in doing that, I'm using the square root property, so I actually need to put a plus or minus in front of my square root. So this will become x equals plus or minus the square root of zy over the square root of 4. So notice I can break up this square root into either square root over a square root, or I could have just left it as one singular square root. However, I broke it up because I can't actually take the square root of 4. So my final answer here then will be plus or minus the square root of zy over 2, because the square root of 4 is 2. Okay, so that's the idea when you have like a square in a formula. So in this case, I have b equals 3 over k squared, and I need to solve for k. So remember, math is not a spectator sport, so I think it would be actually a really great idea if you paused here and tried to solve for k, just to make sure you've got this idea. Hit play when you're ready. So k squared is in the denominator, and I want to get rid of the denominators, so I'm just going to start by multiplying both sides by k squared so that I drop those out. So then I'm left with k squared b equals 3. So I need to get the k by itself. So I'll go ahead and I'll divide both sides by b, so I have k squared equals 3 over b. So now when I take the square root, I have the square root of 3 over b, so I'm using my square root property. Okay. Now, in this particular case, this is a little tricky because if I were to break this up, I have the square root of 3 over the square root of b. So one of the ways of dealing with square roots is that we can't have square roots in the denominator, so I have to rationalize this. So in the previous one, I got to take the square root of 4. In this case, I can't take the square root of 4, so I just have to rationalize. So with square roots, these are the easiest to rationalize, so I just multiply by the square root of b. So now this becomes the square root of 3b, and then here, square root of b times square root of b will mean that I'm just left with b's. The square roots kind of effectively cancel out in a way. Okay, so that's working with squares. So now let's talk about how do you work with a formula that has a square root in it. So now I want to solve for b. So I have a equals the square root of b over c. Okay, now in this case, the letter that I want to solve for is encumbered by this square root. So I actually can't do anything until I get rid of this square root. So the first thing that I've got to do then is to get rid of a square root, you square both sides, right? So this will become a squared equals now just b over c. Okay. So now I have a fraction, and I want to get rid of my fractions, so I will go ahead and just multiply by the denominator on each side. So I have a squared c equals b, and oh, look at that, I actually solved. So yeah, usually when you have a square root, that's usually begging for you to square both sides. So with that in mind, let's take a look at b here. You want to solve this for z. So why don't you pause here, give this a try, hit play when you're ready. Math is not a spectator sport. Okay, so first things first, I square both sides, so I get x squared equals 3y over z. So this square root was over the whole thing, right? So now that whole square root is gone, and I'm just left with the guts inside of the square root. Okay, cool. So now I have a fraction. So I'll go ahead and I'll multiply both sides by z. So my z's drop out, and now I'm left with x squared z equals 3y. Okay, so now I have to remind myself, wait, what was I actually solving for? Oh, right, I was solving for z. So I need to solve for this here. So all I have to do then is I have to just divide both sides by x squared. And I get z equals 3y over x squared. No problems there, so we are done. Okay, so those are two types of problems. I want to look at one other type of formula that can come up. So for this last one, so I've got, I want to solve for x. So I have kx squared plus cx minus d equals 0. So what makes this different from the previous problems is that I have both an x squared and an x, which means that this type of problem is what? This is just a classic quadratic, but instead of having numbers, now it has like letters where all the numbers would normally be. So since this is quadratic, the only way that I'm going to solve this is the quadratic formula. And this will feel a little wacky in this case because when I set up my A, B, and C, it's going to feel a little weird. But let's see, what's in the A position? So in the A position, that's whatever's next to the squared term, right? So that'll be k. And maybe just to remind you, so when we use the quadratic formula, so I'm assuming that I have something of this form. So in where the x squared is, what's in front of it is a k. Okay, and then next, what's my B? So in the B position is this C. And then in the C position, so you got to kind of extrapolate here, and so now in the C position I have this minus D. So this is one of the weirdest parts of kind of dealing with, let's see, this is a terrible D, with dealing with these types of formula problems. But now I can just plug in my quadratic formula. So my quadratic formula, maybe I'll just write it off on the side here. Here's my quadratic formula that I'm just going to follow, but I'm going to use, instead of A, B, and C, I'm going to use the letters that I've picked out. So this will become negative c plus or minus the square root of c squared minus 4, and then let's see, times k times negative d, all of this over 2 times k. Okay, so now the last thing that we're going to do here is we're just going to see like what else can I actually simplify. And a lot of times with these problems, it's not much. So let me make a little space. Okay, so if I simplify this, I have negative c plus or minus the square root. So this becomes c squared, so negative 4 times k times negative d. These negatives will become a positive 4kd over 2k. And this is all that you can do. Sometimes people want to simplify this more, but remember, like when it comes to simplifying radicals, you can only simplify when we're talking about like multiplying things together. So this is the rule. If I have something like a squared plus b squared, I am not allowed to take square root of a squared plus square root of b squared. This is not a thing, right? So this rule does not exist. So there is actually nothing else that I can do with this particular problem. So that's the real trick, I think, for these. Okay, so let's go through this one together. So what I would love for you to do is we're going to be solving for b. So again, this is a little disorienting because we have all these other variables. But I would love it if you would just take a moment to declare what your a, b, and c in the quadratic formula are going to be. And why don't you set that up and then hit play just to check where you're at. Okay, so I'm solving for a. So in my a position, oops, let me grab a different color. So in my a position is an a. In my b position is a negative 5. And in my c position is an m. Okay, so this will become, so my b will equal, so negative 5 will be positive 5 plus or minus the square root of negative 5 squared minus 4 times a times m over 2a. So let's see what else we can do here. So this becomes 5 plus or minus the square root. So negative 5 squared is 25, and then minus 4am over 2a. And again, I can't break this down any farther. So even though I see a 25 and a 4, I don't have a rule that allows me to break this down any farther. So this is as good as it gets. Okay, cool. So I have just one more here, and I think there's a little bit of a twist to this one. So now we're solving for k. So once again, I would love if you would just pause the video, try this one from start to finish, and if you get it, then you can feel pretty confident on this topic. Hit play when you're ready. Okay, in the A position is 1/2. Now, in the B position is all of -5n, and then in the C position is m. So we're solving for k here, right? So this is a -5 and an m. This all is just going to get grouped into being the coefficient. Okay, so to solve for k, let's see, I'm going to take -b, which will become +5n plus or minus the square root of -5n squared minus 4 times 1/2 times m, all of this over 2 times 1/2. Okay, so this becomes 5n plus or minus the square root. Okay, now be careful with this. I have to square both the 5 and the n. So 5 squared is 25, n squared is n squared. So this right here becomes 25n squared because this exponent has to count to both things that it's squaring. Next, 4 times 1/2 is 2, so I'm just left with minus 2m. And then in the denominator, 2 times 1/2 is just going to become 1. So do you need a denominator in this case? You technically don't, so you could actually just write this as your final answer. And once again, there's nothing else that you can do to simplify this. Okay, and so that brings us to the end of this video. If you found it helpful, would love it if you hit that like or subscribe button. Then I will talk to you guys in another video. Peace.